7 minutes. That's the entire gap between two brothers whose net worth 20 years later will differ by over $1 million. Two men, same face, same laugh, same childhood bedroom, glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to the ceiling in their mother's house. 20 years from now, one of them retires early, house paid off, a portfolio quietly funding his life. The other, just as smart, just as hardworking, will still be running the numbers on whether 55 is realistic. The difference didn't come from talent. It came from a letter, a signature, and 7 minutes. You are Marcus. Across town lives Daniel, your twin, younger by 7 minutes. For 30 years, that detail meant nothing. Then, suddenly, it meant everything. Your grandmother raised you both for stretches of childhood while your parents worked double shifts. She taught you to balance a checkbook at her kitchen table. She always said money was a tool, not a personality. She never had much, but she always had $20 to slip you both before you left. She loved you equally. That's what makes the next thing feel almost cruel, because inheritance rarely announces itself as fair. She passed at 89, the same year you and Daniel turned 30. Her estate wasn't large. A modest house, some savings, an old life insurance policy. After the dust settled, just over $200,000. But here's the detail that bends two lives into two different shapes. Her will, drafted 11 years earlier, left the bulk of it, $100,000, to my eldest grandson. Not split, eldest. Daniel was born at 11:47 p.m. You at 11:54. 7 minutes in a hospital neither of you remember. Now those 7 minutes are worth 6 figures. You remember the reading of the will, the lawyer's flat voice, Daniel beside you, and you watching his face the way you'd watch a mirror, waiting for the reflection to crack. It didn't, not visibly. He congratulated you, and he meant it, mostly. But something in the room shifted. You wouldn't feel it fully for years, not until you tried to trace back where two identical lives forked. At 30, you were renting a 2-bedroom apartment, mid-level project manager, $4,000 saved, a car with 90,000 miles on it. Daniel was 32, renting nearby, working a similar job with almost the same 4,000 saved. On paper, you were the same man. That was the whole point of the experiment your grandmother never meant to run. Then the check cleared, and you weren't the same man anymore. The first year, you didn't do anything dramatic. No sports car, no early retirement fantasy. You paid off $11,000 in student debt that had been bleeding you for a decade. You put $20,000 into an index fund a coworker mentioned once. You parked $40,000 in savings, telling yourself it was for a house someday. The rest just sat there, a strange new weight, money you weren't sure you'd earned the right to enjoy. Daniel kept doing what he'd always done. Worked, saved a little, worried about rent. You still had dinner most Sundays, and for a while the money didn't come up. But you noticed things. You stopped panicking when your car needed a new transmission. You said yes to a pricier apartment without 6 months of hand-wringing. Most of all, you noticed you'd started thinking about risk differently, not recklessly, but with a quiet permission you hadn't had access to a year earlier. That permission is the real inheritance, not the $100,000, what it did to your nervous system. By 33, the fork became visible. A college friend was starting a logistics software company and needed an early investor. $10,000 for equity that might be worth nothing. The old you would have said no instantly. $10,000 was too much of your net worth to gamble. But the new you, the you with a cushion, said yes. Not because you'd become braver by nature. You were braver by balance sheet. Money doesn't necessarily change who you are. It changes what you can afford to try. Daniel got the same pitch. He believed in it too. He wanted in. But $10,000 was a quarter of his liquid net worth, and his lease was up, and his car had started making a noise he didn't like. He said no, not from lack of conviction, but lack of slack. 2 years later, the company sold for a modest return. Your $10,000 became $31,000. Daniel's zero was still zero. Neither of you did anything wrong. One of you simply had room to be wrong, and it paid off. Here's the part of this story that rarely gets told honestly. Risk tolerance isn't just a personality trait. It's a function of margin. The freedom to take a swing, to leave a stable job, to bet on a friend's idea. to negotiate harder because you're not one missed paycheck from disaster. That freedom is manufactured by cushion. For you, cushion arrived in a single check at 30. For Daniel, it never did. By 35, the paths had split for reasons that had nothing to do with intelligence or effort. You left project management for a smaller company, more equity upside, a 15% pay cut in year one. Terrifying on paper. But you had six figures quietly sitting behind you. A net most people never get to stand on. The bet worked. By 38, you were earning 40% more than you would have at the old job, and your equity was compounding quietly in the background. Daniel, at 35, made a different kind of good decision. He stayed. He couldn't afford the pay cut, so he doubled down on being excellent where he already was. He got promoted twice. He became the kind of good that comes from having no fallback, the kind that refuses to be anything less than essential. By 40, Daniel had a solid, respectable income. Not spectacular, but stable, entirely his own. And here's what the story insists on being honest about. Daniel isn't a cautionary tale. He built something real without a net, brick by brick. There's even an argument that his caution made him more resilient than you. When a recession hit in your early 40s and your equity took a 60% paper haircut, you panicked in a way Daniel never did, because you'd never learned what it felt like to have nothing and survive anyway. Daniel had learned that lesson a decade earlier, on repeat. It made him calm in exactly the moment you weren't. But calm doesn't compound the way capital does. That's the uncomfortable arithmetic underneath this whole story. Picture the math laid out plainly. If that $100,000 invested imperfectly, some in the startup bet, most eventually in index funds, grew at roughly 8% a year for 2 decades, it becomes about $466,000 by the time you're 50. Now add the fact that the cushion let you jump into a higher-paying, higher-equity job 7 years earlier than you otherwise would have. The gap widens in ways that have nothing to do with the original $100,000 at all. The money was never just money. It was a fork in the timeline that kept forking. By 45, you owned a home outright. The down payment funded partly by the inheritance, partly by the startup windfall. Daniel was still renting. Not from poor choices. In the years he tried to save for a down payment, rents in his city climbed faster than his savings could. He was in a race he could never actually win. By 50, 20 years after that will was read in a lawyer's beige office. The numbers, side by side with no names attached, would look like they belonged to 2 different economic classes. Not 2 men who share 99% of their DNA. Your net worth sits around $1.4 million. Home equity, index funds that finally got serious attention in your late 30s, the startup stake that eventually got acquired, retirement accounts maxed every year because you were never bailing yourself out of emergencies. You're not flashy, you still drive a practical car. But you have what people rarely say out loud when they talk about wealth: options. A sabbatical, if you wanted one. Help with a kid's down payment without blinking. A bad year that wouldn't shake your whole structure. Daniel's net worth sits around $310,000, almost entirely retirement savings, built the slow way. No home equity, no windfall, just 20 years of disciplined, unaided climbing. It's not nothing. Honestly, it's a solid outcome for someone who started with $4,000 and no inheritance. But it's a quarter of what you have. And the gap isn't explained by 20 years of better decisions. It's explained by 7 minutes in a hospital room, and a will drafted by a woman who loved you both the same, but wrote the document the way tradition told her to. Here's the part worth sitting with. When you and Daniel talk now, and you still talk every week, there's no resentment in the room, or none either of you says out loud. What's there instead is a quiet awareness that the 2 of you ran an accidental experiment neither of you asked for. Same genes, same upbringing, same work ethic. Daniel, if anything, worked harder because he had to. And yet, your timeline splits so completely that a stranger meeting you both today would assume you came from entirely different financial worlds. That's the quiet correction this story is built to deliver. Not a lesson about who deserves what, but a check on the story we like to tell ourselves. That wealth is mostly a referendum on character. Sometimes it is. Effort matters. Discipline matters. Daniel is proof you can build something real with nothing but consistency and time. But timing matters too. Access to capital matters. The freedom to take one calculated risk at exactly the right moment. A freedom that exists in your life or doesn't, often independent of anything you've earned, matters more than most people are comfortable admitting. So if you're watching this wondering where you'd land, the twin with the check or the twin without, the honest answer is that most of us are some blend of both, at different points in our lives. A down payment from a parent, a rent-free year after college, a cushion that showed up once and quietly changed what you believed you could survive. The 7 minutes were never really about age. They were about which brother got permission to be wrong and which one had to be right every single time. That's the inheritance nobody puts in the will.